Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm going to be reviewing the Zoo Audio Method bookshelf. I actually purchased these speakers myself. Took about 5 weeks from the purchase date to the delivery date. And there's a few things I want to get out of the way up front. First of all, this isn't going to be a positive review. It's going to be a pretty negative review. Now, I got to say that I don't like doing negative reviews. When I do a negative review, it can cost you subscriptions. But you all know, if you've been watching me for a while, that I don't let those reasons stop me from doing negative reviews. I tell you what I hear, I show you the data, and I basically just try to inform you, keeping myself as honest the best way I can. Another thing, I always listen to these speakers before I measure them. I know some people will immediately jump to, well, I listen with my ears and not with my measurements. Cool. So do I. If you think for a minute that the whole reason I'm in this YouTube stuff is just to share measurements, you're crazy. I've been doing this stuff for 20 something years now, listening to speakers and building systems way before I even knew how to take a measurement. Okay. Secondly, or thirdly, I listen to these using a couple different sets of amplifiers. So the first set would be the Macintosh MC611 mono blocks. And then the other amplifier is the Macintosh MC275 tube amplifier. My preamp is a Macintosh C55. And finally, I know a few people who have reviewed these speakers. I have talked to them. And I basically said, these are probably the worst speakers I've heard, and they have disagreed. They said, hey, did you break them in properly? Yep, broke them in for about a week off and on with pink noise at about 80 decibels or so. They said, hey, did you try turning them this way? Well, initially I stood them standing straight up like you would normally. But they said, hey, lay them on the side. So I tried laying them on the side. No matter what configuration I put these in. Sideways, upside down, hanging from the ceiling. I'm kidding about that one. Close to the wall, away from the wall, pointed at me, pointed away from me. I don't like these speakers. For me, literally 10 seconds into the very first demo track I used, first track off of Norah Jones' The Fall album, there's a snare. That snare did not have the attack or the clarity that it should have. Number one, first off, as I continue to listen more, I noticed this was a theme. I also noticed that the lower mid-range was really kind of missing, and there was definitely no mid-bass attack. The other aspect about this speaker that was very odd, and it's hard to put into words, but we do have measurements that help make it make sense, is that with the high frequency, sometimes things are bright, shrill, sharp. Other times they're soft, very subdued. The majority of the time, I never really felt like these speakers were doing anything in the way of accuracy. But most importantly, they were very unengaging to me. I seem to be the only reviewer who does not like these speakers, which then in fact asks you a simple question: were these speakers defective? Well, again, number one, I ordered them directly from the manufacturer. They arrived to me. I listened to them for some period of time. I broke them in, and then I measured them. Both of them measure pretty much the same. So that checks out. Number two, Ron at New Record Day reviewed these. He had some measurements. I sent him mine. He said, yep, that's pretty much how mine measured as well. So the speakers are fine. They're not broken. There's nothing wrong with the speakers other than the fact that, in my opinion, it's a very poor design. Okay? So now let's get on with the majority of the review here. As I said earlier, I listen to these in a variety of ways. One thing that I'm listening for is neutrality. A lot of people listen for different things, and we can talk about preference all day long. And if you only care about what your ears hear, then please don't jump in my comments saying things like, well, you're hearing wrong, because I'm telling you what my ears heard. The significant lack of detail from these speakers. So if you're talking brass, horns, woodwinds, and snares for that snap and attack, missing from this speaker. 10 seconds in, notice that, okay? The mid-range, some might call it warm, and the reason why is above about 300 hertz or so. It's not elevated, but it's not as low as the rest of the mid-range, from like 500 to about 1K. But below that 300 hertz or so, they're declined. And male vocals are very subdued. That's the best way I can put it. So listening to male vocal tracks, you notice like it's just kind of lower in level, and the meat of their vocal isn't there. The other thing I notice is that rhythm sections, especially guitar, bass guitars, they don't, there's no groove in them. It doesn't make me move. Going to the high frequency, sometimes these speakers are sibilant, and then sometimes they weren't at all. And honest to goodness, it confused me many times because I would start to write on my notes, sibilant, and then I'd go to the next track and it'd be a different vocal, and I would be like, okay, well, why is that one not sibilant? Now, sibilance usually lies in about 5 to 8 kilohertz, plus or minus a little bit. Female sibilance is a little bit higher in frequency. Male sibilance is a little bit lower in frequency. If you don't know what sibilance is, it's just a sharp S sound. Now, it can come from vocals, but it can also come from instruments. And in instruments, it's mostly noticed as, I would say, probably a glare. Aside from this, going higher in frequency, if you talk about cymbals, we talk about hi-hats, crashes, rides, those all sound very unnatural. Again, because some particular sounds are a little bit too accentuated and some are a little bit subdued. I was confused by that, but it's in the data and I'll show you where. And then finally, let's talk about dynamicism. So there's this aspect of higher sensitivity speakers, or this notion that higher sensitivity speakers are more dynamic just because they're higher sensitivity. Well, I've known for years that that's not the case. I've plenty of data to back that up. But typically, it is the case. It's not always the case, but it typically is. With this speaker, it is not the case. There is not a lot of dynamic headroom here in this particular speaker. And in fact, the distortion in the higher frequencies causes what I would tend to call an electronic glare. Now, the reason I say an electronic glare is because in many cases using a wideband speaker, which is not a wideband, but follow me. If you use a wideband speaker, they narrow up pretty quickly in radiation. If you point them directly at you and you are in the near field, then you're going to be okay. It's going to still be mostly a neutral speaker, assuming that the wideband speaker has well-damped cone modal breakup issues. Okay, so if they're well-damped, then they don't break up pretty significantly. ScanSpeak 10F is a small little 4-inch full range speaker. It does very well all the way up to about 20K. Very well damped for its modal breakup or resonance of the cone. With that in mind, once you get into a room and you start getting further and further away from a full range speaker, that high frequency starts to drop off. So sometimes what you'll do is you'll grab EQ and you'll just start bringing up the top end. You'll use maybe a parametric filter or a high shelf, and you'll just bring up the top end until you get it to about where you like it. When you do that, most of the time, you can also introduce additional distortion, and it will be showing up as odd order distortion because you can be running into the limits of the amplifier. So as you're EQing this thing up, you're running into the limits of your amplifier. You're almost getting to clipping, and you're raising that third order and fifth order and so on elements of distortion in the higher frequencies. Okay. So with this speaker, what I tended to notice was that cymbals and hi-hats and things of that nature, not only did they not sound right in level, but they had a little bit too much glare, too much bite to them, and it sounded unnatural. Now, I didn't know why that was the case until I saw the data, and then I thought, oh, I've seen that before. I know what that is. And it's kind of a good example of where data can be very, very helpful, and you don't need it to hear these things, but it's helpful to know where it comes from. Now, if we move on and talk about space, soundstage, and imaging and things like that, what I found was that these speakers definitely work best when they are not pointed at you at the listening position. If you tow them out directly out into the room, so where they're parallel with the wall behind it, or the front wall, that worked best. That gave me a more even dispersion pattern at my listening position. And it also helped fill in some of the lower treble, upper treble region because there's a pretty significant suck out in that region. It's not the same 2 to 4K I'm talking about where the attack lies. It's a little bit higher up. And you're going to see that in the data too. When you tow those speakers out, it evens out the interaction with the room and the sidewalls, and it gives you a little bit more immersion, if you will. Now, the issue here for me is that some sounds were immersive and some sounds were not. Now, if you think about a speaker that's radiating sound out into the room and it's radiating forward and it's radiating off to the sides, ideally you want that same sound that's going directly to your ears regardless of how it's facing, the first sound wave to hit your ear, you want that to be very similar in tonality as the sound that hits the sidewalls and then reflects back. Because what they do is they help to reinforce that sound. If they're different in tonality, then they can result in some significant smearing. They can also result in intelligibility issues, like say you're listening to a voice. Focus is kind of out the window. You run into a lot of issues. With these speakers facing directly at you, you're absolutely going to have those issues. If you toe them out, you're going to subdue that direct on-axis dip. You're going to smooth that out a little bit, and the sidewall reflections are going to be a little bit more matched. But even still, I did not get the submersive effect from these speakers because their off-axis response that's hitting the wall and then coming back to your ears, it's so different than even the 0 to 20 degrees response that there is no hope. There's no hope. Seriously, if you listen to a reference speaker right in front of you side by side, they will sound completely different because of that reason. This speaker is not radiating the sound in the same fashion forward or even within a reasonable range as it is off to the sidewalls at a further angle, okay? Now, if we talk about vertical radiation, there's a really narrow sweet spot because the mid-range is beaming and the tweeter is wide open. I'm going to show you that in the data too. If we talk about bass extension, I already said it doesn't exist. In my notes, I wrote down these speakers sound like they roll off at around 70 hertz. I mean, there's just really nothing below that. And frankly, there were times where I thought it was just nothing below 100 hertz. But 70 hertz kind of seems to be about right based on what I'm seeing in the data. Now, going back to the high sensitivity, yeah, these measured about 90 decibels on average through the vocal region of about 300 to 3 kilohertz. But outside of that, and especially going higher in frequency, it's a coin toss. So with all of that said, I also want to mention that these speakers do have a 60-day return policy. I bought these. I'm not sending them back. That's not how I do reviews. I don't buy speakers to send them back. These have already been bought by somebody who has a pair of these speakers and who really enjoys them. I sold them at a $500 loss. So if you want to help me keep doing what I'm doing, please consider joining my Patreon channel, or you can use any of my generic affiliate links that are going to be in the description below. And it doesn't matter what you buy through those links. You can buy a TV from Crutchfield. You can buy deodorant from Amazon. It does not matter. Just click that link and go buy something. That helps me keep doing what I'm doing. So now I want to give you an example of what this speaker sounds like. I'm going to do the sound clip thing. If you're not familiar with that, what I do is I play pink noise unaltered. And then I follow that up with pink noise that's altered to match the profile of this speaker's frequency response. This is taken from anechoic data. That anechoic data is then convolved with the impulse response into the pink noise. So what you're hearing is original pink noise, speaker convolved response pink noise. And that will tell you how far off this speaker is from reference. Okay? Now let's start with the data. All of the data that you're about to see is captured using my Clipple near-field scanner. It is a state-of-the-art robotic device that allows me to get full anechoic data in a non-anechoic room. That allows me to bring this kind of information to you guys. Looking at the frequency response, you can see that the average sensitivity is about 90.7 decibels, as I said earlier. And let's look at the top end. All right, so we got a suck out around 1.5 to about 3K or so. And then a serious null that goes down to about 19 decibels down from the mean. And then on the top end, we've got a boost here. F3 at 92 hertz, F10 at 56 hertz. This explains why this speaker doesn't get that low. And that's the thing that you're paying for the sensitivity being high. When you have high sensitivity, you can almost guarantee 99% of the time that your bass is going to be extremely weak, or you're going to have a huge enclosure. That matters more for subwoofers. In a case like this, we see that's what you get. So it's no real surprise that you're going to have a lack of bass with a higher sensitivity compared to other bookshelf speakers of roughly the same size. Personally, I'd rather have a trade-off somewhere. Power's relatively cheap. And as I said earlier, you think that with higher sensitivity, you're going to get more dynamics. That's not always the case. And if anybody tells you that higher sensitivity equals better dynamics, they're wrong. Now, some may ask, well, what if you use a high impedance output amplifier and then listen to it that way? Will that change the sound? Yeah, in my previous video, I discussed all of that, how output impedance really can impact the sound of a speaker given the speaker's qualities. And what we see here, though, is that in some cases, yes, if you have a very high impedance output amplifier, there's about 1.5 decibels difference on the low end of a boost. Maybe that could help. And on the top end, you've got about 1 decibel of a boost. And then down here through this region, you've got maybe about 1 decibel, 0.5 decibel or so of a cut. But all in all, it's not enough to get rid of this huge suck out, this high peaking, and then flatten out the bass. No matter what amplifier you use, you're still going to have the same frequency response fundamental issues that I heard. Here's the CEA 2034 data set. On-axis performance is the same as you just saw a minute ago, but we want to look down here at the directivity to give us an idea of how well the radiation pattern is being maintained. So as the speaker goes from lower to higher frequency, the sound shifts from omnidirectional to more forward directional. And ideally, that's what you want the pattern to continue doing. If it jumps out at different frequencies, then it keeps a non-continuous directivity pattern. And basically that means that the reflections to the side of the wall are higher in amplitude than the sound that is coming directly at you, which is what I talked about earlier. So if we look down here and we had a linear line, sort of, doesn't it? Then we would have a more smooth directivity. But when we don't, and we see these dips and this peak and this significant dip right here, that shows us what we already know, which is that the on-axis response differs significantly in this case from the off-axis response. This is the estimated in-room response, and this blue line represents basically what I heard in my room. So we have in-room extension to around 70 hertz. You can see that the lower mid-range, upper mid-bass area here is lower in amplitude compared to the mid-range area right through here. We have about a 5 to 7 decibel suck out in the upper mid-range. So that's that laid back, lack of attack, lack of dynamicism, and for me, a significant lack of engagement in the sound profile. And then we just have wacky high frequency response. And that most likely is due to the comb filtering inside of the compression driver. So that funnel that sends out the sound at the higher frequency, there's sound bouncing around in there. And instead of coming out smooth and even, it's getting canceled as you move ranges, right? Now, I do want to note that this region right here in the on-axis response that we saw, in this region, smooths out some in the room right through here. And that's because the sidewall reflections are coming back and they are a bit smoothed out compared to the direct sound. So in the listening room, you're going to have a more balanced sound than what that huge dip shows you. And I know some people are saying, well, I don't hear that huge dip, but that's why. And so the estimated in-room response also kind of confirms that. But the estimated in-room response also confirms that what I heard and that significant lack of attack in the upper mid-range. Horizontal response is pretty bad. As I already said, when you go off axis from the speaker, that big dip around 7K or so starts to fill in. And this shows us that. So compared to the direct sound, the off axis sound is much higher in amplitude. And then the same thing for the vertical response. You have a really high amplitude off axis response. Burst decay shows us significant ringing in the upper mid-range and the higher treble region that you can see right here. Harmonic distortion at 86 decibels and then at 96 decibels. And this is 1 meter away for just the one speaker. So in a room, this is going to roughly equate to about 92 decibels for a pair of speakers at about 3 meters away. Now, that isn't to say that you're going to be listening that loudly, but it does give you an idea of the limits of this speaker. And especially in the higher frequency where you can see this purple and red line are matched, that purple line is the third order harmonic. And if you look at that, you can see it peaks up significantly around 6 to 7 kilohertz. And that gives us a glimpse into why I heard that edgy or metallic sound that I talked about earlier in the upper treble region for the hi-hat and cymbal and things of that nature. Now, if we look at multi-tone distortion, we can see that that goes above my personal 3% threshold. So you're going to hear a lot of forwardness and edginess, probably crispness in the upper frequency response for that region. And if we just look at separate sine sweeps, then get an idea of the instantaneous compression, then this is what we have here. So we have a big dip around 2K, a peak around 4K, and a huge dip between about 5 and 7K. So there's a lot of issues in terms of dynamic range capability with the high frequency end of this speaker. And then we look at impedance to kind of get an idea of how much power is this thing going to draw, what kind of amplification might we need. So most 8 ohm capable amplifiers are probably going to be okay. Minimum impedance dips to about 5.8 ohm. That's not too big of a deal. EPDR at 3 ohm. So if you're going to use a class A or an AB amplifier, just make sure that you have proper ventilation. That's going to be a big thing. I also want to point out some of these resonances that I'm seeing here. So in summary, I don't like this speaker at all. There really, for me, isn't a single redeeming quality about it. I know I am definitely in the minority of reviewers, and I'm not sure that anybody else who's reviewed this speaker, at least on the YouTube platform, has said anything bad about them, but that's fine. I will talk to y'all later. Take care.